Recording now.
Sounds good. Let me pin that. Perfect. All right. Well, I will call the meeting to order. We'll start with a roll call. McKee here. Bodema.
Here.
Nichols.
Here.
Schultz.
Here.
Thomas.
Here.
All righty. We are all here. And I will hand it off to Kendra to present the residential zoning district ordinance update discussion part 1.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Council. It's a pretty short presentation, like the staff report. Jess, if you go to the next slide. Just for the members of the public, the council did identify ordinance updates as a priority for this year, and residential district standards were identified as a priority within that. So at the February 25th meeting, we talked about a work plan. As part of step 1, I reached out to individual council members to have a one-on-one conversation about priorities. Those priorities are summarized in the packet. I do want to point out, I reached out to Councilmember Nichols. There was an error in my Microsoft notes that had a numbering error, but the comments reflect 1 through starting at 1 for Councilmember Nichols' comments. Tonight's work session is for you to discuss the top priorities for the council as a whole after reflecting on individual council members' comments, and then hopefully come up with your top priority and then perhaps a couple of other 2021 priorities so that we can prepare for a joint meeting with the Planning Commission on April 22nd. So the next slide consolidates my effort to try to consolidate all of those comments that are in the staff report from our conversations, again, without a lot of detail, but just the topics in no particular order. I came up with, when I summarized your comments, about 18 priorities from the 4 different council members that I spoke to. And then I included in the packet a working draft that Brad and Jessica and I had done in 2019 pre-pandemic in terms of some staff ordinance updates that had been identified either through the comprehensive plan or just working through the ordinance. And then I also attached the Planning Commission priorities for 2021 that were presented to you at your last meeting. So if you go to the next slide, Jess. Really, tonight is your meeting, and I am here to listen and take direction. So I'm hoping the council can review those priorities that came from the council and other sources, discuss, and then recommend. You know, I've said in the packet 1 to 3 priorities that maybe we can tackle this year, and then direct staff to start on 1. And once we identify that, maybe we can talk more about sort of what the direction is so that we can prepare sample ordinances for the joint work session on the 22nd. So I don't know, Jess, if it helps to go back to the council's list on slide 2, I think it was. But that is my presentation, Mr. Mayor, and I'm all ears.
Perfect. Thank you, Kendra. And let's see here if I can get back to everyone's view. I just have the probably on my end. There we go, gallery. So we have at least a starting list here. I think there's a lot of different ways we could go with this conversation. But I kind of like what Kendra said, I think we should pick 3 or 4 top issues that we want to really tackle first from this, or I guess if there's something that wasn't covered in this and that we decided is still a priority, we could put that in as well. But I think there's not a wrong way to do this. I'll open it up to anyone if they want to start with something in particular that they think we should put high up in the priority list.
I'll go ahead and pitch mine first, just to give some direction. So the first one that I discussed with Kendra was the idea of what's variously called a conservation subdivision ordinance or a open space and protection ordinance. I see that as actually addressing items 2, 3, and 7, possibly indirectly also 8. So I did a little bit of preparatory research before my meeting with Kendra and found a bunch of articles and some model ordinances that kind of speak to how those are typically put together. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert, but I would say that I know enough to pitch it. So I'll go ahead and try to pitch it to you folks now. So the harm that we're trying to solve, I think, is the way that development has been happening in Corcoran over the last 10 years has been largely similar to what you would see in any other suburban city. So you get quarter to third acre lots, sometimes significantly smaller, relatively high density, and we're not doing a great job of maintaining open space or that rural feel in the MUSA area specifically. How these ordinances differ from what we have today, rather than focusing on individual lot size, they create an option to allow developers to target a overall density per acre across the entirety of the development. So if I'm going to develop 250 acres, I would be able to target 3 to 5 homes per acre, typically, depending on how it's zoned, as long as I can get across that entire parcel the right density. I could have much smaller lots potentially, but I'm maintaining open spaces on the remainder. And those spaces can become a variety of things. They might stay working farms, they might be community gardens, they might be parks, they might be open spaces, they might be natural wildflower meadows like you might see over in the Wild Meadows development. So it's a way of maintaining the density commitments that we have to keep with the Met Council, while maintaining a lot of the open spaces that we value. And the amount of open space that you allow can be varied depending on how you set up the ordinance, but broadly, and we can always tweak how we would do it. How they typically function, what I've read, is you would have a revision to the subdivision and PUD ordinances to create a density incentive to allow builders to get to the higher end of the allowed density in whatever underlying zoning district there is, if they adopt a conservation approach to that district. And if they choose to do that, they could get to the higher ends of the density that you would allow. They would also save considerable funds in having to put in fewer roads, having to put in less utilities and infrastructure, and the homes actually tend to appreciate faster than conventional developments as well. So you draw in people who will be attracted to the environment that you're going to create for them, and then their values increase faster than they would if they had gone into a conventional neighborhood. And the city wins because it reduces our costs for maintenance on roads and sidewalks because everything is more compact if you organize it in that way. So I feel like we can achieve a lot of positives, not only for the city, but also for residents and for developers, if we take a hard look at it. And there's a variety of ways we could do it. I'm very confident we could find one that would work for Corcoran.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
So my understanding is that so long as we're 3 per acre per Met Council standards for sewer, that we can have 100 on 3 acres and then 30 acres of open space. Am I wrong about that, or are you talking about different? Is this different than what we'd be able to do today, or are you talking about an incentive? And I like the concept, so I'm just trying to filter through the differences.
I'll let Kendra and Brad speak to what the Met Council expects and requires. But largely my understanding is, yes, it doesn't necessarily matter how many acres you put the housing on, as long as you're achieving the overall density goal. I think that's satisfactory. And I don't know if you could do 100 on 3 practically, but conceptually, rather than allowing individual homes, we could go to the level where you allow townhouses instead to get higher density and maintain more open space, maybe even apartments. We could talk about that.
No, I'm not suggesting we should put 100 houses on 3 acres. I think I'd prefer 1/9 of a house on 3 acres. I'm asking whether currently, if the policy would prevent somebody from putting 3+ on an acre and then having open space. You and I have talked about it before, and I think we're both on the same page for the desired result. I just wanted clarity on the different, and we're on the same page. I think we all are on the same page. Of how do we make development different? And I'm wondering how that would make development choices different. Tell me about that.
I didn't quite pull the exact question that you had.
If a builder came in, couldn't they do that without being, if they did the exact thing you're talking about, have, as I suggested, 100 houses, or just do your same equation. You could put 100 houses on 3 acres, have 10 empty acres that would not be against the rules. Is that right or not?
I think the limit that they would run into currently is there is still a lot size standard that they have been requesting flexibility on.
So you're, okay, so that's what you're
at.
at. In the end, you're asking for a lot size standard that's different than what is today, and that would accomplish.
You would end up with smaller individual footprints for homes than we would have today, most likely. But
Yeah,
it would
okay.
only do that you get more open space.
That's what
So
I'm asking. That is the answer. Thank you.
I'm sorry, my computer cut out on that. What was the answer?
The answer was you would end up with homes on a smaller individual lot. in
No
exchange
minimum
for
lot
having
size.
More open space elsewhere in that development.
So can I ask you a couple questions off this?
Sure.
One, are any of these ordinances in effect within the Met Council's realm currently? And the other question is, what's the incentive to the builder to follow this approach? How do you incentivize a builder to do what you're asking them to do?
So they are in effect in several cities. We actually talked and we were interviewing the candidates for Charter Commission. One of the candidates, the one that Brad suggested, Daniel, implemented something very similar in Hanover. They're in effect in Lake Elmo. They've been adopted in Elk River and a few other places too, and in other states as well. The incentive for the builder comes about in a couple ways. The first is they tend to encounter lower cost, because if you're putting fewer, if you're expanding utilities and roads across fewer overall acres, you can end up cutting your road building expenses by about a factor of 2. So they save a couple $1 million typically in their development. They can usually sell for a bit more than they would get otherwise. And if you allow incentives for density and how they preserve the open space, you can give them a little bit more profit than they would have achieved otherwise with, quarter to third acre lots. So that they benefit on being able to charge more, being able to pay less for utilities. And overall, it seems to be a win-win-win for all stakeholders.
And what protects the open space from not being developed in the future?
So the models that I've seen, they talk about adopting conservation easements to protect the open space and or turning it over to the homeowners association to maintain.
Okay. Thank you.
In some cases, they turn it over to the city as well. So there's a variety of ways that it could be done.
That's kind of the key part of it, is that part stays open space. Otherwise, it's kind of defeating the entire purpose of what we'd be trying to accomplish with that.
Tom could turn it into a park, right?
What?
The other Tom.
Oh, other Tom.
Tom Anderson. He's sitting on the call.
There you
It
go.
could, in theory, be a park, right?
Absolutely. That happens a lot.
Yes, so long as we're willing to maintain it.
And that's kind of where the HOA is handy, because it's an amenity first to the neighborhood. And typically the expenses are relatively modest unless it's a super high intensity use. Like if you have a working community garden, that might be a little more expensive to maintain, depending on how you service it. But if it's routine trail maintenance, is typically not terrible. We could also think about incentives to tie into the trail network in the city, and maybe you get a little bit of bonus density if it's tied into a city trail versus just a private trail, as a way to build out that connected part of our vision.
Okay. I certainly like it in theory, and I'd put it up there as kind of one of the higher priorities that I'd like to address or look into more off the bat. Jeremy, did you have anything else that you wanted to add besides the conservation side of things, or are you good for now?
I support many, if not most
Yeah.
of these. I just feel like this is the one that's going to have the biggest positive outcome.
Gotcha.
And it's the most time critical in the sense that if we're developing, 300 acres a year, the longer we wait to do something like this, the less open space we preserve.
Right.
So, Mayor,
Yeah.
so regarding the format we are going at right now, so obviously we have 18 and if we take each of them to be discussed, I don't know if we have time for that today, right? So
Yeah, I wasn't
just
planning
from
on that.
how we're going to move forward, do we want to look at this and something like what we did for a strategy meetings to see are there top 4 or 5 in this that we kind of look at, does the majority agree on to even debate further? So I think the open space, I think it's hands down, it's easy because it's one of my top ones too. So, and I'm glad that we had a discussion on it. But there are, some of this even I added, which I'm pretty sure like for the rest 4, like I don't think that's my top thing to work on, right? Especially since, and I had a chat with Brad earlier in the week, and he was like, looking at the bandwidth of the team and what we can realistically achieve is 3 or 4 in a year, depending on the size. Obviously, you pick up a big item, maybe the 4 comes down to 3 or a 2. But depending on what we decide to knock off, we have to have limits or kind of have guardrails in place in what we're discussing at. So do we want to first go through and see? And I know that some of this does lack the detail, but if there's a majority saying I like this, then maybe kind of explain that out for everybody else on why you think that is a top 5 and kind of figure out, because I think this is more about direction to the staff, right? Less of us drafting the ordinance sitting here today.
Right.
Is that fair in my understanding of how I thought this meeting was going to go?
That works for me. If we want to do it, trying to think if there's anything we should combine to kind of get this list
It's shorter.
little more pared down, like kind of like we did at the previous work session, or if we just want to take it as is and how many votes do we get, and go from there.
Well,
Does Kendra still have access to the slide? It's in edit mode, Kendra? Like, would you be able to update this real time if we were like, hey, combine 2, 3, 4, and you just copy paste and put it in the same line? Is that a possibility, assuming you're controlling the slide?
I think Jessica is.
Isn't there, I mean, we could combine all 18 of them into one line, but I think we got to be careful about that. But
why don't
Manoj, I agree with you. We got to narrow it down.
Yeah, I just don't want to waste time, right? We could debate this to to heaven and hell and back. But we need to start looking at what are the 3 and 4 we want to do.
I think
Alan
all
talk
5
real
of us.
quick.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. He's just been trying to talk for a little bit.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. What I was going to suggest is that why don't the people that put forth these ideas pick their top 3 and just talk about those then? Because I don't know what people are meaning when if they want to look at accessory dwelling units, what part of it do you want to look at? What's the concern there? So if that's one of your top 3, without me knowing what your concern is, I can't rightly say I'm going to vote for it.
Right. That
So
makes
maybe
sense.
give like
Fair
a
enough.
3-sentence summary of what each one means.
Yeah, just give a summary of what your thought process of putting these forward and what your concern is. And then I think we can take that list of, there's probably only nine items, mine's covered and someone else. So there's really only 9 between the 3 of you, and put
Right.
that forward.
Well, I can start right there for the both 5 and 6. And I mentioned them. I don't know if anyone else did, but the main reason I talked about them was because I wanted to make sure that was on the list for the conversation with the Planning Commission for that upcoming work session. I have several ideas about what I want to do there, but it's not fully formulated yet because I want to hear from the planning commissioners. So I think in terms of if we're coming up with our top priorities, we can remove those from the conversation for today. So I think there are things that I can work on the side, and when I talk to other people, I can kind of do that on my own and then come to the council later with that. But in terms of what we're prioritizing as a whole and two staff, I don't think we need to, unless someone feels differently about that and has an issue they'd like to address in that. I think we don't have to worry about those two.
I would
Maybe
say
I can go.
Sorry, go ahead, Manoj.
Oh, sure. So fair point, Alan. So I'll mention there are a few in here, which if you ask me to list down as the top 3 or 4, I wouldn't call them in my own thoughts out. But there are definitely, I'm looking at 5 maybe here that I would say are priorities for me, and we can decide how much we can do based on others. One is the open space and trees. And I put that as one. I know Jeremy talked about it. I don't have anything to add to what he said, but that is definitely one of the things that we want to do is keep more open space, even if that means going smaller lot sizes. Looking at incentives for developers where they may not have to do curbs if they have 10 homes in the center of a development with trees all around and open space around it. So we don't have to give it the urban feeling, right? So kind of look at other incentives that can be done from an open space standpoint and how we can cater or take development towards that model. That's one. The second thing that I feel strongly about personally is the conditional uses we have. I think that needs to be reviewed and taken out. Every use, either it's a permitted use in a zone or they come for, it comes as a rezoning application or things like that. I don't like the idea of having conditional uses there, be it Nelson being around Bellwether or be it Eagle Brook Church around the neighborhood, right? So I just don't like conditional uses, and that's me personally. So that's where if everybody agrees, we look at it, and both the planning function as well as the planning commissioners come back with their thoughts around it. Associated with that is the flexibility that they get with PUDs. Not a big fan of that district itself. So do we look at taking that off? Do we need it? Is there any reason why we should have it? Kind of debate around it. So my conditional uses and PUD are 2 things that I've bundled together in my head. I think I saw this in multiple shapes, sizes, and forms. The next one is transition between zones. It's been something that I've never liked about how our comp plan ended up being, where you have business parks next to residential zones without transitions in between and things like that. High density uses between low to high and mixed, how that's transition. So kind of look at that and see, do we need transitions? Is that something we add between as we move from zone to zone? That's another. And the last one that I would call out that's important to me is the development rights program, right? So review that again. I'm not saying it should be abandoned or it needs to change, but kind of look at it. I'm not a big fan of rights moving between properties when you flat them together and move them out again. Do we put restrictions on it saying that it has to have the same ownership at least? But then I also know that there have been instances when that has worked out pretty well, where it didn't harm. It was actually done better once it got combined. But in certain scenarios, I think, Alan, I think you were the one who mentioned it, where you didn't want what happened at the subdivision at Kerenemi, right? So kind of look at our development rights, how it can shift, and how do we kind of limit and work with that. So those are my main ones. Some of these are big, some may not be as big, but those are the ones if I were to vote for my top 5, those would be the 5. To relist
Mr.
on the
Mayor.
open space ordinance,
Yeah.
the conditional uses, the PUD, transition between zones, and review our development rights program.
Gotcha. John, go ahead.
I saw the Kerenemi issue mentioned twice, and I feel like that worked exactly how it's supposed to. But the shared driveway would have if we bump into shared driveways all the time, and that would have taken care of that issue. Shared private drives are nothing but problems for the city council, and that's an aside because it was sort of it creates a mess, which it's done almost every time. I want to just throw out there the idea that if we can't agree on, or if we don't arrive at 3 and 4, we have had subcommittees where 2 council people and go through and do a lot of work on their own about certain specific topics such as these. And I don't think we're all in disagreement that we need to look at these and change things. I'm open to having a subcommittee that really looks into this hard for 6 months or however long, and then really comes in here with thorough ideas about halfway, and then gets feedback, and then kind of goes forward. Good city councils will do that, where we'll take the reins and work on it offline, come back with a finished product, keep everybody up to date. I'm totally cool with that. I think it'd be good. We got a lot of stuff. You guys in particular ran on getting a bunch of stuff done with straightening out some of these codes. And I know Manoj, you want to cut like half of the things, and I'm totally cool with that. I agree with what you're saying. I'm totally open to having somebody take the reins on these and go 50 miles down the road.
That's certainly an option. If we if we don't feel like we have enough here and can't come up with a top 2 or 3 that we really want to hit, then yeah, I'd totally be open to that.
I think there are a number of things on the list that are relatively straightforward to do, and a subcommittee might be very effective in proposing those to boost the bandwidth applied to some of these things. So I would be supportive of that too. Maybe we just allocate the more complicated things to staff to bring back to council, or it might take a little more due diligence and research to harmonize everything.
I have one issue with something that's been brought up several times, and that they're on maps significant environmental areas or significant ecological sites. We have an issue coming up today where somebody's actually creating a significant ecological site. Wetlands creation is awesome, and it creates significant ecological features to our town. And we want to make sure that we don't penalize people who have significant ecological areas in our town. Otherwise, they're going to keep it private. And I think I've seen it a couple times where people want to restrict development around them. And if they're created, you got to be careful about that, because people aren't going to want to do them if they get penalized in the back end.
Maybe or go ahead, Jeremy.
I actually think that if we are able to go down the road of a conservation subdivision, those become more valuable. Because it doesn't penalize you for density. If you decide to take a low spot and make it a formal wetland, you can still get the same overall density on your property if you've done that with a third of it. Versus if you actually remove buildable acres, you need a certain lot size to build on. It could be a negative to make that conversion.
Yeah, there have been significant areas identified on the map, and there have been suggestions to take away development rights from those identified areas. And then also, like behind my house, somebody made 20 acres of park, and the next thing you know, instead of having 15 building rights, they have 45, which obviously impacts what happens behind my house. You got to be sensitive to whatever happens when you either give or take away building rights, depending upon what happens with your conservation strategies. That was the first thing that jumped out at me as like a reservation on this list.
Gotcha. Okay. In terms of mine, I think Manoj, kind of what you said in your priorities, I'm pretty much right with you, and I feel like you were pretty much, or at least mostly in line with what Jeremy was saying. The conservation, addressing PUDs, I might have a little bit different of an idea on some options there. I know you're more looking at, do we get rid of them entirely, which I'd open to looking into by all means. The screening in the buffer zones, tree preservation kind of tied into that. And then the the work session that that you guys had at the previous council from, I think it was October 22nd, the non-residential uses and residential zones, which kind of gets into what Manoj was saying about the conditional uses a little bit. Those are probably my major priorities of this list. And I feel like maybe that's a good place to start discussing things, because we've already had some conversations, or the previous council has, about that, about the conditional uses and just general. A lot of that conversation was about the size of conditional uses in residential zones, and how do you go about limiting, so you're not having a 70,000 square foot building, or 800 car parking lot, or whatever it ends up being. And I know we've discussed several different ways to get there, but there never really got to a point of consensus on this is the way we'd want to do that. So maybe we start by discussing that.
Yeah, I think if I have to pick my top three, the simple, easy, important one is the CUP removal. I think it avoids the need to try to be creative in how you divide by size and intensity of the conditional use, to just take them out altogether and make sure that we have appropriate locations and actual as primary uses and other. So I think my second, sort of tied for first, is the conservation subdivision notion. And I'm only going to pick two. I think those are the most important. Lots of these other ones are good ideas too. Not opposed to any of them, but if I have to pick, those would be the two that I would shoot for.
Okay. So, does that give us at least a little bit more whittled down list? Do we still want to do some sort of vote to try to get that, or do we think we have at least a baseline to work on here?
Mr. Mayor?
Yeah.
If I may, I have a spreadsheet going here, and I've been trying to keep track. I don't actually have solid responses yet from council members Schultz or Bodema on their, I guess, top 3 or 5.
Yeah.
The rest I think I have marked pretty well.
Alan or John?
I only had one that came to mind in Kendra's discussion. I mean,
I did like that one though.
I'm open to listening to all these. I just need to get some more information on where your guys' thought processes are on some of them.
Gotcha.
I did send about 10 articles to Brad. Maybe he could forward the ones on the conservation subdivision to anybody who's interested in reading them.
In this case, I'd probably concede to the majority. I think they're all good. You guys are passionate about them. I feel like we've struggled for 8 years trying to figure out how to make our town unique. And I think that a lot of these ideas, especially if you can wrap them into one, help with that. I like that you removed the accessory building standards. Just in the future, I have a pole barn for a neighbor on one piece of my property, and I kind of don't get it. I don't know if we want a bunch of neighborhoods made up of only pole barns. I love pole barns. I've got one and a half of them.
I mostly put that one on there because I know it was in the report from the Planning Commission, I believe.
Yeah, I know. That's all. I don't really. I actually like these ideas. Whatever you come up with the top 3, I think I'll just go along with it. Honestly.
Okay.
So I had a question while we're at it. I know that I didn't hear anybody else talk about transition between zones. Is that something, I'm trying to whittle down my 5 to 3 because I think that's what we're trying to get to. So thoughts around transition between zones.
I do support that. I think that
I do too. The buffer zones or some sort of screening between zones.
Mr. Mayor, if I may, just to kind of jump in here, maybe Kendra, you're taking notes as well. So The ones that have what I'm seeing as a majority of support are the PUD ordinance, number 3, open space and preservation ordinance. However, I think the council members Nichols' initial statements, I think you probably could include 2 and 7. So with 4, you kind of get 2 and 7, if that makes some sense. And then the third one actually.
Brad, I would actually keep those separate, and when we get to the point and talk about that, because remember the OS&P ordinance right now is a rural ordinance, so I do want to talk about that if we look at clusters. I think we should keep them separate for now.
Yeah.
Can we please take the tree preservation ordinance out? All that'll do is cause everybody, including me, to cut down every tree on my property.
I'd
I've
like
cut
to
down thousands of trees on my property, and you guys don't get a say because you don't own the land. I've also planted 3,000 trees, and I will go. I'll fight it like crazy, and it will be super ineffective.
Yeah.
fair enough.
I think
think
the objective is to make sure that people have an incentive to save the trees and that it makes the land more valuable and doesn't cause complications for development. And I think the conservation subdivision will address the desire to maintain the forest that we have without encountering.
Then get rid of the language of preservation ordinance. The last time we tried to do this, hundreds of trees were cut down like during the discussion.
And that's why I'd like to try to do it in a way that we tailor it very specifically, so that's not a concern. And I know that the Planning Commission, I believe Meredith and a couple others on the commission have expressed some ideas on how to do that. And I'd like to have that conversation with the commission, but maybe we don't need to prioritize it here, and that can be something maybe we delegate more towards the Planning Commission after.
Tree preservation incentive that's all you need to do.
Well, and I think you need to incorporate it. If you're going to have a discussion about PUD, that's where you incorporate it, because that's where the benefit is.
I think I hear what Alan and John are saying. I don't think we need to say that we're going to work on a tree preservation ordinance. Rather, it should be a result of our other policies that we end up having more trees, right? So we don't need to have that and get everybody to John's point that we don't want him out there with an axe right now, right? So let's not call it that. If it ends up having, because that's what we want. We want the rural feeling, and you're not going to get that without our open landscape and without our trees. So let the rest of the changes that we're trying to do feed to it, rather than say that if you touch your tree, you're going to pay for it. Right? That's not what we're trying to do. That's when land use and land rights are always going to be protected here, at least. So let's not call it that. I think that's fair enough. Let's not call it tree preservation versus that will be a result of what we're trying to do.
Okay. So we can take that out and kind of work it into the other stuff. Okay, so Brad, were you kind of in the middle of, or did you finish what you were good?
No, I know it's all a helpful conversation. I appreciate that. So then I guess what I'm hearing as the top 3, and please tell me if I'm hearing this wrong. And Councilmember Nichols, what did you call that type of development again, just so I get the term right?
Conservation subdivision ordinance. And typically it would include a revision to the PUD ordinance and the subdivision ordinance, is how you would implement it.
Thank you. So whether they're separate or not, the top 3, I continue to hear, one being the conservation subdivision ordinance, which also may include the PUD, but then I'm hearing there's other issues with the PUD, so maybe PUD is maybe on its own review. And the buffer zones and screening between uses, those are the consistent ones I'm hearing.
I think the other one was removal of conditional uses in residential zones.
And is it fair to say that the development rights, we're just going to move it for the next session or next CDs as we get to it? And these are the top 3 we're going to work on right now. Is that?
That would be my thought. Yes.
Yeah. These will have the biggest bang for our invested time and money for now, but
Bandwidth is the limiting factor here, so absolutely.
So I heard 5 items in Brad's list: PUD, conservation subdivision, which warrants some discussion about how that's different from our current OS&P. And did tree pres come out? Because I had that as 3, and then buffer zones and transitions and removal of CUP. So I had 5 from Brad's list.
It will be 4, I think. We're going to take out the tree preservation ordinance as such, from what I
Okay.
understand. So it'll be 4 that we prioritize.
Thank you.
OS&P and conservation together as a one? Is that,
Well, that's my question. If that becomes one of the priorities, I want to understand, is the idea to throw away the OS&P and start over, to revise that, or is this idea to try to do something in the urban area rather than the rural area? I'm not exactly sure what the topic is, but we can flesh that out if that becomes the top priority.
I think the core of the idea is to deal with the MUSA. And it may also flow into updates for the OS&P if we choose to do that. The PUD draft that I've seen from the Pennsylvania group talked about the subdivision ordinance sort of working like a multiplier on the underlying zoning district. Which means that it could potentially have desirable impacts on the OS&P areas too, but we wouldn't have to set it up that is something I think we need to figure out in more detail as we dive into it. So maybe limit it to the MUSA for now, and depending on how that develops, maybe we bring some of the more rural areas into scope too.
for OS&P?
Yes.
Yeah, I think what I heard you saying, council member, is you're not interested in looking at the OS&P for now, but creating a new tool for a conservation development in the MUSA.
Correct. And I would say the OS&P is certainly desirable. I would like to see that be used more than it is. And I think ultimately it might make sense to look at how those incentives are set up, and maybe they need to be made larger to get it to be economical for developers to do that type of development more than they have.
Well, the whole design about the OS&P is to encourage development where there are no sewer and water services.
Right.
Right, but it's only temporary. It's not a preservation ordinance of any kind. Once water and sewer is in the area of an OS&P, the OS&P can develop out to its full potential of the land.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
So I
So
think
the
there's
the
some,
open space then wouldn't be preserved once MUSA expands.
that's correct.
Right?
Yeah, it's only a temporary preservation.
Okay.
Well, we wouldn't directly be looking at that right now. We'd be looking at within the MUSA.
Yeah, but you can use OS&P in the MUSA too. It's
Right.
available inside and outside the MUSA. I just wanted to clarify that because I think at the general public at large, when we say OS&P, because preservation is in the word, they think we are actually preserving
Oh, I
land.
see what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good distinction.
That's a good call out, Alan. So, so Jeremy, based on what I'm hearing and what I've at least started and discussed in the past, our goal is to set up something where there would be permanent conservation done as part of promoting this kind of a development
Correct.
area, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So it wouldn't be transitional, like, once city water comes in, like they could build it out to full potential. If we go this route with added incentives, if we end up having any, then they stay conserved. Like it would be an easement. Yeah.
Right. It would be preserved in the same way that it would be if you allowed another Tavera to build out that area completely. It's just that all of the homes that would go into that development would be clustered on a smaller footprint.
Is there anything to say that they're actually building homes versus building high density housing units?
We'd have to decide that. Some of the drafts that I've seen, they actually have A larger density is allowed if you preserve more than half of the land. So for example, if you set aside 70% of the parcel, you might allow an apartment instead of just homes. We don't have to do it that way ourselves if we feel like that's not a good policy, but it's been done other places.
Yeah. I'd be interested in learning more about it and see where that goes.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say I'm going to support it because I need to know the downstream effects to it, because I could potentially see people coming in and wanting to have an apartment complex in an area that we've slated for single family homes in the
Right.
past.
Yeah, I would have that same concern about having something in there to make sure that it's still the type of residential building, you know, if it's single family homes or whatever it is, and they can't just put a townhouse on there, or not a townhouse, maybe, or apartment on there instead, and you know, get the density that way. So I think if it was written in such a way where still single family homes in the areas we want single family homes, I'd be in support of it 100%. But I would be a little concerned about the potential abuse of it with apartments or things like that.
I hear that. I understand. I'm fine pursuing either path.
Okay. So we have a pseudo list. What number are we actually at now that I know Kendra kind of pointed out there was a couple that should be separate. Here, I've got 1, 2, 3.
I
Four?
still have 4 as listed as PUD, conservation subdivision in the MUSA, buffer zones and transitions, and removal of CUPs. But I think I keep them separate because what I think I hear Councilmember Nichols talking about is very specific, and it's not about PUDs. Conservation is separate. You could accomplish some of those goals by revising a PUD, but if you wanted to try to write an ordinance to get wildflower at Lake Elmo, you're not going to do that by revising your PUD ordinance. You're going to have to write a conservation subdivision ordinance.
Okay.
So I think they're still separate. So I think we're still at 4.
4. Well, if we want to get it down, if it's important that we get it down to 3, do we just want to vote on our top single priority and go from there, or top 2 priorities, or how do you want to do it? Open it up.
Tom.
Yeah.
So when I had a chat with Brad earlier, and again, this need not be a science, is that, you know, we pick 2 and then work on it, and the second half go at another 2.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we just slot when we have 4, that by and large consensus on at least I like it, I want to learn more, or this makes sense. So in that case, just take the 4 and just decide which one goes in the first half and which one goes in the second half of the year.
Okay.
So that way, you know, it's even lesser, right? You're not doing 3, you're doing 2 and 2. And for the year, you have the 4 of them still slotted, then compromise on something we think we need to look at.
Okay.
And maybe we could vote for that. Like, do you want it in the first half or second half, right? That'll be a quick in and out.
So of the 4, do we want to have
pick 2 to?
Well, do you want to give a little more detail as to
yeah.
what you're actually looking for in a change to the current ordinances? What prompted you to bring these up?
So before I go there, I want to get a little bit of clarity from Kendra. Kendra, so and the 4 you have, which would logically group? Are there ones that you think will logically group, either on the work you're going to put in kind of analyzing those, or you know, just from size standpoint, you're like, oh, these 2 in the first half doesn't make sense, right? Like you should have split that in 2 times of the year. Do you have any thoughts around the 4 that you've listed up? You're mute.
I think when I chatted with each of you, I said, you know, this is like the old joke about how to eat an elephant 1 bite at a time. I really think they are 4 separate discussions. None of these it's easy to do. I mean, removing CUPs sounds easy. until you think about, how you make sure that the types of uses we want to see in our community are allowed somewhere, and then test that the council really is okay with those going ahead without any council review. So that, even that one, which looks simple, I don't think will be simple. So I really think they're all different, and it's really just what's most important to the council to move ahead with.
Well, how about,
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead. Who was talking?
No, I was just thanking her. Like, that makes sense. So that brings me back to Alan, just to address your question, right? Before I don't want to leave you hanging. So I'll run through them again, right? So the open space, I think Jeremy has talked about that at length. There's nothing more I want to add to it. The conditional uses, my biggest prompt was how the church was going to be in the backyard of homes and single-use, single-family homes. And we just, I don't like that. I didn't like that. There was not much debate around the conditional use for Nelson. I'm a big fan that they are in town, and they are going to give us the tax revenue we need to grow, but it was a conditional use. So anytime it's a conditional use and not an accepted use, I like to put the effort in to make sure that everything is an accepted use. And to Kendra's point, I don't mind it going through, hey, this is an allowed use and I'm going to do it, right? And that's where we have the foresight to plan it properly. With respect to conditional uses, transition between zones, I think that's self-explanatory. Look at the Cook Highlands proposal that came in. They're asking for, even if they were asking for a rezoning and we went ahead and did it, again, I don't know if you're going to do it or not, but it's not come here. But if we ended up doing it, where's the transition between 4-story apartments and single-family homes? So there is a practical need to plan for that. And I thought this was pretty self-explanatory, at least for, hey, let's look at this, right? Again, we're not drafting an ordinance here, so I'm expecting that's what Kendra is going to come back after analysis on, okay, this makes sense, this is how we can draft it, does this meet what you're looking for? And then we could have a good enough educated debate around it, versus right now we're just slotting the topics we want to look at. Now, obviously, if there's something that's more important to you in this to relook at, we could obviously look at the ranking and see if that can get in instead of these four.
No, I just want to get a better understanding of why people are putting things forth, what the issue is. I mean, I understand there's concern about conditional use permit and what's allowed in what areas, but the conditional use permit says we're allowing it, but we're putting conditions on how you do your business, right? Or how you develop that. So if you don't have conditional use, then you put you have to come up with zone for everything under the sun. And then you just have to blanketly say, you're free to do whatever you want in that zone.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. You'd be picking ideally, I guess, areas that you're more comfortable with those going, but you would lose control over how you can put conditions on them and how you can limit certain aspects of it. Yeah.
So I mean, back to Alan's point, right? Alan has this pointed remark. So you're talking about residential zones today, right? What under the sun are we thinking that we're going to put on residential zones? There's going to be limited uses that we think that are eligible to be in residential zones, and we should be able to find places that it needs to go to. Versus, I get your concern, like if you are taking conditions out of every district we have, right? The commercial, industrial, light, then we have to start thinking more broadly. You're talking about residential zones. And that's why I'm very passionate about it.
Right.
But uses in the residential should be lower.
Here's an example of a conditional use in a residential zone. A school. So most people would love to have an elementary school in their neighborhood that they could just walk their children down to school each day.
Well, I think this goes back to the conversation that John had at the previous meeting, the previous work session, which I think is a good conversation to have.
Mm-hmm.
But sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, Alan.
No, I'm just saying, but to blanketly remove it, then you'd have to specifically say where in your city you're going to dictate where a school can go. right?
So
Or
no,
where
you
a
can make
church
it a
can go.
permitted use. So you can make it a permit. So I think we are preempting the discussion we should be having once we have more data. But since we are at it, you have schools, you have churches, you have like certain uses that we are calling it conditional today. Let's say churches can't go in, schools permitted use. I think between us and the planning function, we can decide on the current conditional uses if they stay as permitted uses. I mean, if we all love having elementary schools in our homes or next to our homes, let's call it a permitted use and call it a day. It doesn't have to be conditional, right? If that's the thought process, we can take a decision. We don't have to leave it as a conditional use for a debate every time. Now, again, this is my point of view. I'm one of five, right? So once we come back with some study that Kendra comes back with, vote on it. 4 of you don't agree, it's not in. We move on, right? I think I just want to have that discussion about potentially taking it off. And if realistically it's not, we're not going to do it. Like, this is not the yay, nay discussion. So that's all my concern is. Like, I think we're jumping ahead of the curve saying, I want to get more details. Where this is the meeting to decide what are we going to get details on, right? So that's where I'm a little lost on some of these requirements, and let me understand this more, because that's what we're asking it to do.
Okay, then maybe I should frame my question more as this. We're going to vote on things where we get more information, but we're not voting on things where we're going to make an ordinance change at this time. Is that what we're saying? So we're gonna say these are the top 4 things we want to learn more information about, and we'll decide at that point if we want to invest more staff time and city resources into making a change.
No,
Is that a fair statement?
I think so. It's a good call out. So that's not why I want. My understanding is which are the 4 items we're going to spend resources on to see if it needs to change. And if there is a change that makes sense, we as a group decide, do we implement it or not? But we are deciding what are the areas that we would like to look at. Now, if majority does not think conditional uses are not an issue, let's not even put it on Canberra to look at it.
That's fine. I think now I think we're on the same page. We're basically voting to explore these 4 options and decide if we're going to continue to go at a later point, invest more money into a change. Is that a fair statement?
It is for me. I'm seeing some nods. I can't see John, but I'm thinking he's silent. He agrees.
Yeah.
My understanding of this is we're voting to assign effort to research these topics and explore what our options would be. And then we'll reconvene and discuss those and decide we're going to develop it into an ordinance that we will then vote on, or we're not going to go down that path on this particular topic.
Okay.
Have you seen one of my PowerPoints in city council ever? My preference would be you come forward with the PowerPoint to the rest of the council, because if you're not confident 100% that this makes sense, the city staff is not a research arm for the city council. They got other things to do. And I would love it if somebody tabled the discussion with a PowerPoint or some sort of thing that we can go on. I'm all for it, but we need a little bit more granular than we should explore this. I'm totally on record as saying I'm all for this, but we got to make sure that we spend the resources of the city. The city is not to decide whether it's a good idea or not. We are to decide whether it's a good idea or not, and make impacts from our position as city council members. And I'm open to all these ideas, but I would like them a little bit more detailed before we spend 6 months researching them, then decide later it's not a good idea.
Yeah,
Or maybe I think you've all researched them, but I want to see your research.
So I would say research this in the intention of changing it. The part my concern is, like, if it comes back and say, if we do this, the research says there's this 10 negative effects. And to your point, John, you asking the city council to research this, we could go about what we want to prioritize, but asking the administration or the policymakers, it's almost like asking the hospital administration to decide how the doctor should perform a surgery. You have a planning function for a reason. You want them to do their part also, right? Now, this is not the right, I think that's why we look at the majority and say, is this where you want your city staff to spend time? Let's take that call, right? Let's show of hands, let's decide, do we want to do this? Because otherwise, what are we doing here? I am not in the mood to sit around and wait 6 months and waste time. Let's just call it quits right now and say, we're not doing anything, let's go home. Right? So
Well,
let's
Well,
take
I
a
don't
vote.
think,
Let's not
I
keep
don't
that
think
open.
John's saying that. I think what John's saying is basically, if you think there's an issue, give me some information to support your rationale that there is an issue, and then I'll agree to spend city money to get information on the issue to make a change versus we have a list of issues. Now let's spend staff money and time to find me information to support my rationale that there's an issue.
I don't think that's
Fair
what
enough.
we're
So
saying.
let's-
I think what
so
we're
let's
looking
go.
for is for staff to develop a preferred implementation of what this would look like for Corcoran. So if we're talking about, say, the conservation subdivision ordinance, we would be looking to collaborate with staff to develop what that would look like for us. And at the point of deciding today, we're essentially setting out on a expedition to define what that would be for Corcoran. It's not defining, yes, there is a problem. I think we all know that there is a development trend that doesn't fit our vision. We're not trying to establish the problem. We're trying to establish what is the preferred embodiment of the solution. And we may find at the end of it, we love it, and we vote 5-0 to do it. We may find that we vote 3-2 because it's kind of on the fence. We may find that nobody likes it and we have to abandon it. But we
Jeremy,
don't know
you've
until we
got-
find the implementation.
You've gone halfway in identifying the problem, and staff would tell you that their job is to implement the policies of the city council, and staff can't be directed to figure out what the solution is when it's the council's job to provide staff with this potential solutions. I'm all for what you guys are saying, but sometimes when you're a leader, you got to bring everybody on board and do some work and say, this is what we need to change. This is why. Here's what Lake Elmo did. Write it down. Let us see it. And then the job of staff is to either cross the I's or dot the T's and see if it's implementable. But their job isn't to go investigate Lake Elmo and see if their laws apply to Corcoran. In my 4 years, sometimes when I got a little, I don't know, when I got a little fly in my belly and I think something's going wrong, I got to do a bunch of investigation on my own. And then I got to come to everybody and say, hey, this is what we need to do. This is what I'm thinking about. I need you guys on board so we can get staff on board.
Mhm.
So I would love to see, and this is what I would expect. You guys ran on this and I'm on board with it. These are the things we should change, and this is why. You tell me what's wrong with this list.
You should stop saying you're not bored on it. Everything you're doing after that, it's like saying, I love you, but everything you said before the but is bullshit. You know that, right? So let's stop saying you're not bored with it for starters, right? So let's take it specific, right? Let's go specific. Does anybody over here think that we have a transition problem between zones? Let's identify the problem.
I don't.
You don't. Good.
So we should have
Jeremy,
15 different zones to
wait.
identify.
Let's get everybody voices in, right? So who among here thinks that there's a problem with transition between zones? If nobody thinks, let's not spend time on it. It's perfect.
Well,
Because
give me some
there is a transition
information
between
to
zones.
support why you think there's a problem. That's what John's saying.
What's the
Okay, so
transition zone?
transition
20
between
feet,
zones?
Okay, good
20 yards,
fun. So,
trees,
When you have
creek.
conflicting land uses that abut each other, so comes to mind the area up by Bellwether, the industrial and the residential there. It's going to be the same thing on the southwest corner of town where it's industrial and single family or low density residential. Potentially, I've seen it done with other cities where it's also between commercial and industrial and commercial and residential. There's a lot of different options and a lot of different requirements based on how conflicting of a use it is for how much screening, trees, whatever has to be put in between those zones.
Yeah, we've got an issue right now. The substation is going to abut a neighborhood, and so Manoj, I know you don't like this. I won't do it. I'll try not to do it anymore. I agree with the fact that it doesn't fit there. So we need to identify what the solution is. Is it 40 yards? Is it an acre? The staff isn't going to be able to research and come up with look at every ordinance from every town across America. Like, we got to identify some potential solutions for what are the buffers between that? How about 20-foot high trees? Jeremy, you came across the buffer issue. You have some personal experience in that. It's got to be at least 15 high. You can't see it from your deck. You've got to put a berm. That was a potential solution that was turned down. That's our job, is to politicians, whether we like it that term or not, we don't just identify problems. We live in the art of solutions, and that's what we need to do. When you guys talk about solutions, you identify solutions. We need Tom, you just did 3 of them. We need to come forward with those solutions and say, these are the things in that ATV ordinance that has never been seen. I read 15 ATV ordinances from towns across the state, and I implement them into mine. Not saying that like that's the answer for everything, but when you run for city council, all of us, how many hours did you put into that? 500, 200? That's our job.
So John, that's my concern also. The best leaders don't try to do things they're not equipped to do also. It is to identify the problem and hold where the light is. Now I can say, I'm a leader, I'm going to fix your sewer, your electrical, your water, I will fix your budget, I'll make sure you have a job, I'll do your unemployment. Best leaders create an ecosystem and let the experts handle it. We have a planning function, we have a consulting arm of ours, we have them for a reason. If not, we don't need a planning function. Let's send them off and let's 5 of us sit and do planning. Let's do this, right? But then if you have a function, let's call leadership what it is. It is to provide like leadership, not to do that work. Because if you are equipped to do it, you should be applying for a planning role, not to run for city council. I mean, I would take your application, the amount of work you did for the ATV ordinance, boy, you are a shoo-in, right? But the thing is, it's about also taking leadership and identifying that Kendra and the planning team are the most equipped. Now, if you think they are not, and we are more equipped than our planners, don't you see a different problem there? Like, if you think that we are more equipped than they are.
I do, because Kendra costs a fortune, and we're basically volunteers, and we're asking.
We should look at that. We should look at that. Good call out. We're not saying that, right? She costs us a fortune. Let's look at that.
I know. I cost 0 for the work I do. I cost nothing. Everything that I have Kendra do costs the taxpayers money, and I'm super sensitive to that.
Well,
I mean, a fortune is more than
something
0.
that Danny Nadeau told us.
What?
Danny Nadeau told us, and I agree with this, to Manoj's point, the role of council as leaders is to set the vision. The role of the staff is to find the way to implement the vision. So I certainly agree it's our role to identify problems and to set a direction. And I'm fine participating in whatever level Brad insists that I perform to make that happen. But I want to defer to staff as to how they want to see that plan developed. So Brad, how do you want to see this done?
Well, I think actually we have some clarity, I believe, on a couple of the items. From our viewpoint at the staff level, I guess, we do view that we have a pretty clear vision. It is within our purview to do some research and bring you back some options. Maybe not the point that Councilman Bottom went on his solar bug in the belly, as he'll refer to it, I guess, that way. But I'm comfortable with working with Kendra to bring it back. I was just actually texting her. The one area we need probably some more feedback on what it means, though. However, sorry, I'm transitioning off your question, Councilman Nichols, I apologize. So conservation subdivision ordinance, I think we know what this means. Draft a new ordinance for this type of zoning district or incorporate somehow. The buffer zones and screening between different land uses, updating our district standards to enhance buffering. I believe is what I'm hearing there. Removing of conditional uses in residential zones, a significant one, but we're updating the districts to review and allow appropriate uses in those districts without conditions. We are kind of not understanding what the PUD ordinance review is, if it's separate. Is it just actually looking at our PUD district and just going through it? Or is it something more than that? And I apologize, it's 6:42, so we probably only have about 10 or so minutes more.
How does this sound? If we were to pick, the two being the conservation subdivision and the buffer zone screening, and then took the PUD and the removal of conditional uses and created a subcommittee to discuss those, to get them a little bit more info on that, and then present that to staff and the council at a later time, and depending on how long it ends up taking. But that way we have two to start with, two that are in the wings that we're working on the side, whoever's on that subcommittee. And then, I have several other small ones that I'm gonna be working on my own, and presenting to staff and the council down the road too. So would that be an option that works if we did those two as our top priority, and then the other two, which sounds like we kind of want some more information about what they exactly mean, we create a subcommittee to do that?
I think that's a good approach. Sounded like Brad had a good sense already for what the CUP realignment would be, though. I think the
Okay.
PUD is the one that would need some additional definition.
Okay, so if we have three, create a subcommittee just to discuss and figure out more about the PUD changes we'd like to make. So then we have three top priorities. Is that good to start with? Do we want to pick one of those three to, immediately start with, or do we just want to give those three and
The one that I feel I have enough understanding for to give the thumbs up to move forward is the conservation subdivision.
Okay.
The rest of them, I'm on the fence because I don't have enough knowledge of what your viewpoint is on those.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor,
Yeah.
it sounds like we're missing a step, I guess, is maybe what we were having in our work plan. So our next step with this was to meet with the planning commission.
Mhm.
I think maybe we should use that April 22nd time for Kendra and I to kind of flesh these out, get a draft work plan for maybe 1, 2, and 3, which are the conservation subdivision ordinance, buffer zones, and conditional use permits, and bring that back on April 22nd to review and get everyone on board. I'd hate to bring the planning commission in at a point when the council isn't entirely vetted on what wants to be accomplished. I'll throw it out there.
Yeah, we could certainly move those around. What's the rest of the council's thoughts on that? Are you okay with that, everyone? With pushing the...
So what would the deliverable be on the 22nd? What would we expect?
Kendra, jump in here too, but I guess my sense would be an outline of the problem, maybe what a potential solution could be, and a timeline to go along with each one of those. Kendra, how does that sound to you?
I think that's important, and I have some information from different council members, and I think we could bring back a summary of what we think the problem you're trying to solve is, and some ideas of how you could do that. I think it needs to have a little bit of staff time to flesh it out so that everybody understands what the next moves are, and then we could create a new work plan. I think the idea was to take one of these items and wrap it up, right? To get that adopted, and the most important one should get adopted first.
Okay.
So I think we could bring something back with those 3 items, summarizing how we think it might work. Not doing a draft ordinance, but saying, here's some examples of how we think it could be implemented or what the steps are. I don't think we're going to want to discuss all the CUPs in the residential districts, but we could do a list of what they are and at least lay it out for you.
Yeah. That would work, and then we could create that subcommittee to look into the PUD stuff. And that might not be the best, or might not be the worst situation anyway, where I'm thinking we're going to need a longer work session with the planning commission than the hour and a half before a busy meeting. So if we're moving that out to another week, maybe we can find a time that we have a little bit more than an hour and a half with them, because I feel like they have a lot they want to get into. So,
Okay.
Does that work for everyone?
Sounds great.
Perfect. Then that will be the game plan. Regarding the PUD, do we want to determine who's gonna head that, the subcommittee for that? Any volunteers?
I can volunteer.
Okay. And I mean, I'm certainly happy to.
I can do that also.
Okay, if you two, Councilor Nichols and Thomas, want to do that, I guess just maybe we'll plan on you presenting an update to council at a future meeting and kind of let us know where you are and give us a timeline for when you think you'd be ready to fully present, and then we can go from there.
Okay.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you.
All righty. And that is it for this. So I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Nichols.
Second.
Second.
Roll call vote. McKee, aye. Bottoма.
Aye.
Nichols.
Aye.
Schultz.
Aye.
Thomas.
Aye.
Perfect. Thank you, guys. We will be on here in 12 minutes on it's a separate link as well, I think.
Sounds good.
Yep.
See you
Perfect.
later.
See you
See ya.
guys.
Aye.